From the very first months of the Civil War, one city haunted the Union's grand strategy: Vicksburg, Mississippi. Perched on 200-foot bluffs above a sharp bend in the Mississippi River, Vicksburg was a fortress city, the last major Confederate stronghold on the great river, the vital link connecting the Eastern Confederacy to its western territories of Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas. President Abraham Lincoln called it the key. "The war can never be brought to a close," he said, "until that key is in our pocket." The man tasked with turning that key was Ulysses S. Grant, a general who would fail 4 times before finally succeeding in one of the most brilliant campaigns in American military history. This is the story of Grant's 5 attempts to take Vicksburg. To understand why Vicksburg mattered so desperately, we must understand the geography. The Mississippi River was the great highway of 19th century America, the artery through which the commerce of the entire interior flowed. Confederate control of Vicksburg effectively cut the Union in two, blocking river traffic and allowing supplies, troops, and cotton to flow freely between the Confederate states east and west of the river. A Union victory here would split the Confederacy, open the river to Union commerce, and deliver a devastating blow to Southern morale and logistics. The stakes could not have been higher. Ulysses Grant understood all of this. In the fall of 1862, fresh from his victories at Fort Donelson and Shiloh, he turned his eyes south. What followed was a grinding, ingenious, often frustrating campaign that lasted nearly a year. A campaign marked by audacious engineering, waterborne expeditions into snake-infested bayous, bloody repulses on fortified bluffs, and ultimately one of the boldest strategic gambits of the entire war. Grant's first attempt, the Central Mississippi Campaign, October to December 1862. Grant's first plan was straightforward: march south overland through central Mississippi, using the Mississippi Central Railroad as his supply line, while simultaneously sending a force by river to threaten Vicksburg from the north. It seemed sound. In November 1862, Grant pushed his Army of the Tennessee southward, reaching Oxford, Mississippi by late November. Meanwhile, he sent William Tecumseh Sherman with roughly 32,000 men downriver toward the mouth of the Yazoo River, north of Vicksburg. But the plan unraveled swiftly. On December 20th, 1862, Confederate cavalry under Earl Van Dorn struck Grant's massive supply depot at Holly Springs, Mississippi. In a stunning raid, Van Dorn's troopers overwhelmed the Union garrison, torched warehouses stocked with $1.5 million worth of supplies, tore up miles of railroad track, and captured nearly 1,500 Union soldiers. At nearly the same moment, the brilliant Confederate cavalry commander Nathan Bedford Forrest was slashing through western Tennessee, further wrecking Grant's rail lines. Without supplies, without a functioning railroad, Grant had no choice. He abandoned his overland advance and retreated north. The first attempt was over before it had really begun, and Sherman, who had not yet received word of Grant's withdrawal, would now attack Vicksburg alone, setting the stage for the second catastrophe. Grant's second attempt, Sherman at Chickasaw Bluffs, December 1862. Sherman arrived at the mouth of the Yazoo River on December 26, 1862, with about 32,000 men. His plan was to push up the Yazoo, land on the low ground north of Vicksburg called the Yazoo Delta, and storm the bluffs that rose sharply from the swampy bottomland. On the far side of those bluffs sat Vicksburg itself. The terrain was murderous. The only approaches to the bluffs ran through a narrow bottleneck of ground flanked by swamps, bayous, and lakes. Confederate General Stephen Hicks and his men held the high ground with artillery, and they had had time to fortify. Sherman attacked on December 29th. The assault was a disaster. Union troops struggled through waist-deep water, only to be cut down as they tried to climb the steep bluffs under withering fire. In a single day, Sherman lost nearly 1,800 men, killed, wounded, or captured. Confederate losses were barely 200. Sherman withdrew, chastened. The second attempt had failed, and Vicksburg seemed more impregnable than ever. The press was merciless. Grant was accused of incompetence and drunkenness. Politicians in Washington whispered about replacing him. But Grant was not finished. He was already thinking about his next move, and his next, and the one after that. Grant's third and fourth attempts, the Bayou expeditions, January to April 1863. Through the long winter and early spring of 1863, Grant launched a series of ambitious engineering and waterborne experiments designed to find a usable route to Vicksburg, one that avoided the bluffs to the north and the Confederate batteries that lined the riverbank. These operations are sometimes counted separately, but together they represent Grant's sustained effort to crack the Vicksburg puzzle through ingenuity and engineering. The first of these was the Lake Providence expedition. Grant's engineers attempted to open a water route from Lake Providence, Louisiana, a crescent-shaped oxbow lake just west of the Mississippi, through a series of rivers and bayous that might allow gunboats and transports to bypass Vicksburg entirely and emerge on the Red River to the south. The idea was clever, but the execution was nightmarish. The waterways were choked with trees, submerged logs, and vegetation so thick that progress was agonizingly slow. After weeks of backbreaking work, the route was deemed impractical. It was abandoned. The second experiment was the Yazoo Pass expedition. Engineers breached a levee on the Mississippi north of Helena, Arkansas, hoping to send gunboats through the Yazoo Pass, an old channel, into the Coldwater and Tallahatchie rivers, and eventually the Yazoo River, emerging behind Vicksburg's northern defenses. The Confederates responded quickly. They felled enormous trees across the narrow waterway to obstruct the gunboats and constructed a makeshift fort called Fort Pemberton at the junction of the Tallahatchie and Yallabusha rivers. Union gunboats made repeated attacks on the fort in March 1863, but the low, flat terrain gave them no advantage. The fort's cotton bale and earthwork walls absorbed the Union bombardment. The expedition retreated. The third was Steele's Bayou expedition. Admiral David Porter personally led a flotilla of gunboats through the maze of bayous and backwaters north of Vicksburg. Steele's Bayou, Black Bayou, Deer Creek, Rolling Fork, trying to find a way around the Confederate defenses. The gunboats pushed deeper into the wilderness, but the waterways grew so narrow that tree branches raked the smokestacks, and Confederate sharpshooters picked at the crews from the banks. At one point, Porter's flagship was so entangled in vegetation and so threatened by closing Confederate infantry that Sherman had to lead a night march through swampland to rescue the flotilla. The expedition barely escaped. Porter called it the most difficult operation of his career. A fourth scheme involved cutting a canal across the DeSoto Peninsula, the long finger of Louisiana land directly across the river from Vicksburg, to divert the river's current and allow Union ships to bypass the city's batteries entirely. Lincoln himself was enthusiastic about this plan. Grant's soldiers labored for weeks, digging a canal 50 feet wide and 6 feet deep across the peninsula, but the river refused to cooperate. The current stayed in the old channel. When engineers opened the lower end of the canal, the Mississippi simply flooded the work site without cutting a new course. The project was abandoned. And yet, through all these failures, Grant remained calm. He later wrote that he never seriously expected these operations to succeed. They served a different purpose, keeping his army busy and active through a miserable winter, maintaining the appearance of action for a restless northern public while he waited for the ground to dry and for the right moment to strike. That moment came in April 1863. Grant's fifth attempt, the Decisive campaign, April to July 1863. Grant's fifth and final plan was the boldest of all, and the one his superiors in Washington were most opposed to. The idea was this: march his army south through the Louisiana swamps on the west bank of the Mississippi, have Admiral Porter run his gunboat fleet past the Vicksburg batteries under cover of darkness, and then cross the river well south of the city, landing in Mississippi where Confederate forces were weakest. From there, Grant would strike inland, cutting loose from his supply base entirely, and live off the land while maneuvering to isolate and capture Vicksburg from the rear. Henry Halleck in Washington called it reckless. Sherman thought it was a mistake and urged Grant to go back and try a different approach. But Grant had done the calculations in his head. He trusted his army. He trusted himself. On the night of April 16, 1863, Admiral Porter led his fleet past Vicksburg's guns in one of the most dramatic episodes of the war. 12 vessels, ironclad gunboats, transports, and supply barges, steamed south through the darkness as the Confederates opened fire with every gun they had. They lit bales of cotton and buildings on fire on the Louisiana shore to silhouette the Union vessels. Shells tore through the ships. One transport was sunk, but 11 vessels made it through, battered but afloat. On April 29th and 30th, Grant crossed the Mississippi at Bruinsburg, landing 17,000 men on Mississippi soil, the largest amphibious assault in American history up to that point. Confederate General John Pemberton, commanding at Vicksburg, was confused and off balance. Grant moved fast. What followed in the next 17 days was a masterpiece of maneuver warfare. Grant marched his army inland, defeated Confederate forces at Port Gibson on May 1st. He feinted toward Vicksburg, then wheeled northeast toward Jackson, the Mississippi state capital, to deal with a Confederate force under General Joseph Johnston that threatened his rear. Grant captured Jackson on May 14th, driving Johnston's force away. Then he turned back west toward Vicksburg. In a campaign of 17 days, Grant's army marched over 200 miles, fought and won 5 separate battles: Port Gibson, Raymond, Jackson, Champion Hill, and Big Black River Bridge, and inflicted nearly 8,000 Confederate casualties while suffering about 4,400 of his own. He had done what every conventional military thinker said could not be done: cut loose from his supply line and lived off the enemy's territory while winning a campaign of maneuver. By May 18, 1863, Grant's army had Vicksburg surrounded. 2 direct assaults on the fortifications, on May 19th and May 22nd, were repulsed with heavy losses, demonstrating that the Confederate works were too strong to storm. Grant settled in for a siege. For 47 days, the Union Army tightened its grip. Confederate soldiers and Vicksburg civilians alike endured starvation, disease, and relentless artillery bombardment. Civilians dug caves into the hillsides for shelter. The Confederate garrison ate mule meat and rats. Pemberton's men grew too weak to mount a breakout. On July 3, 1863, the same day Robert E. Lee's army was being shattered at Gettysburg, Pemberton sent a letter to Grant requesting terms for surrender. Grant's reply was characteristic. He demanded unconditional surrender. After some negotiation, Grant agreed to parole the garrison rather than ship 30,000 prisoners north, a pragmatic decision that cleared his logistical problems and let him move on quickly. On July 4, 1863, Independence Day, Vicksburg surrendered. The Confederate garrison marched out and stacked their arms. The stars and stripes flew over the city. Conclusion: the significance of Vicksburg. The fall of Vicksburg, combined with the Union victory at Port Hudson 5 days later, gave the Union complete control of the Mississippi River. The Confederacy was split in 2. Texas, Louisiana, and Arkansas were cut off from the eastern Confederate states. Lincoln wrote exuberantly, "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea." For Ulysses Grant, Vicksburg was his masterpiece, the campaign that proved his genius and his iron nerve. He had failed 4 times and kept trying, adapting, learning. When Washington lost faith in him, he kept going. When his subordinates doubted him, he kept going. When the river, the weather, the terrain, and the enemy all conspired against him, he kept going. In March 1864, Lincoln called Grant to Washington and gave him command of all Union armies. The man who had persevered through the bayous and bluffs of Mississippi would go on to pursue Lee relentlessly to Appomattox. Grant himself put it simply: the art of war is simple enough. Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike him as hard as you can, and keep moving on. Vicksburg was where Grant proved he meant every word.